Elliot sat quietly at his workbench in the back of the dusty little shop where he worked as an apprentice. His hands moved steadily, carefully aligning the gears of an old pocket watch. Mr. Abbott, the clockmaker, had taught him that each gear, each tiny spring, and every piece of metal had its purpose. He always said, "Everything in life fits together like a clock. Every part is important, no matter how small." Elliot loved working with his hands, but what fascinated him more than the mechanics of the clocks were the stories they held. Each clock was a part of someone's life, whether it had been carried in a jacket pocket, hanging in a family's kitchen, or ticking away in a study. Elliot often wondered about the people who owned them and the lives they lived. Mr. Abbott had been a clockmaker for as long as anyone could remember. His shop was filled with timepieces of every kind: grandfathers, cuckoos, pocket watches, wristwatches, and even strange broken clocks that hadn't worked in years. Elliot admired Mr. Abbott's steady hand and patience. He had a way of looking at a clock, knowing just what was wrong and how to fix it. Elliot aspired to be just like him one day. One afternoon, a man entered the shop. He was older, with graying hair and a worn expression. He handed Mr. Abbott a small, ornate clock. It was a delicate thing, no bigger than a book, and covered with intricate carvings of flowers and vines. The clock had clearly been cherished, though it had seen better days. Its paint was chipped, and the gold leaf on its edges had faded over time. "This belonged to my father," the man said softly. "He passed away last month. I've been trying to fix it myself, but I think it needs more skill than I have." Mr. Abbott examined the clock closely, his fingers brushing over its surface. "It's a fine piece," he said, nodding. "I'll do my best to restore it." The man thanked Mr. Abbott, and after a few more words, he left the shop, the bell on the door jingling behind him. Elliot watched as Mr. Abbott placed the clock on the workbench. "This is a special one," Mr. Abbott said. "Not because of its design, though it's beautiful, but because of what it means to its owner. This clock is more than just a way to tell time. It's a connection to his father." Elliot nodded. He had always known that clocks were more than just machines. They were symbols of the lives they had been part of, but this was the first time Mr. Abbott had spoken about it so openly. "Would you like to help me restore it?" Mr. Abbott asked, turning to Elliot with a kind smile. "Of course," Elliot replied eagerly. For the next few weeks, Elliot and Mr. Abbott worked together on the clock. It was a complex piece with layers of gears and springs hidden beneath its delicate exterior. Some of the gears had worn down over the years, and the springs were rusted in places. But slowly, piece by piece, they restored the clock to its former glory. They replaced the worn parts, cleaned the rust, and even touched up the faded gold leaf. It was meticulous work, but Elliot found joy in every moment. As they worked, Elliot thought more and more about the man who had brought in the clock and the connection he had to it. He imagined the man's father winding the clock each night, listening to its gentle ticking as he sat in his chair. He imagined the clock sitting on a mantel, or perhaps in a study, quietly marking the passing hours of a long life. And now, with the father gone, the clock was all that remained of those quiet moments. Finally, after weeks of careful work, the clock was finished. Mr. Abbott wound it up, and they both listened as the clock began to tick once more. Its sound was soft, steady, and comforting, like a heartbeat. Elliot felt a sense of satisfaction, not just because they had fixed the clock, but because they had brought something meaningful back to life. The next day, the man returned to the shop. When he saw the clock, his eyes filled with tears. He ran his fingers over the newly restored carvings, and when Mr. Abbott wound it and set it on the counter, the man just stood there for a moment, listening to the ticking sound. "It's perfect," the man said softly. "Thank you, both of you." Elliot felt a warmth spread through him. It was the first time he had been directly thanked by a customer, and it meant more to him than he could have imagined. After the man left, Mr. Abbott turned to Elliot. "You did well," he said. "You're becoming a fine clockmaker. But more than that, you're learning what it truly means to restore something." "What do you mean?" Elliot asked. "Clocks aren't just machines, Elliot," Mr. Abbott said. "They're pieces of people's lives. When we fix them, we're not just repairing metal and gears. We're restoring memories, connections, sometimes even hope. Never forget that. Elliot nodded thoughtfully. He had always loved the mechanics of clocks, but now he understood that there was something deeper to his work. Each clock they repaired was a small piece of someone's life, and restoring it was a way of honoring that life. Years passed, and Elliot eventually became a master clockmaker in his own right. Mr. Abbott retired and passed the shop on to Elliot, who kept the business running just as his mentor had. He worked on all kinds of clocks, some old, some new, some simple, and some incredibly intricate. But no matter the clock, Elliot always remembered what Mr. Abbott had taught him. Clocks were more than just machines. They were carriers of time, of memories, and of meaning. One day, an elderly woman came into the shop carrying an old, battered clock. It had clearly been well loved, but had fallen into disrepair over the years. She placed it gently on the counter and looked at Elliot with hopeful eyes. "This clock belonged to my mother," she said. "It hasn't worked in years, but it was always on our mantle when I was growing up. Every night we'd wind it together before bed. It's one of the few things I have left of her. Do you think you can fix it?" Elliot smiled warmly. "I'll do everything I can," he said. As the woman left, Elliot carried the clock to his workbench and began the familiar process of taking it apart. Inside, he found the same intricate network of gears and springs that he had worked with so many times before. But as he worked, he thought about the woman and the memories she had shared. The clock wasn't just a machine. It was a connection to her mother, a piece of her past that had shaped her present. Elliot worked carefully, with the same dedication he had learned from Mr. Abbott all those years ago. He replaced the broken parts, cleaned the rust, and polished the clock until it gleamed. When the clock was finished, Elliot wound it up and listened as it began to tick once more. The sound was soft, steady, and comforting, just like the clock he had restored with Mr. Abbott so long ago. The next day, the woman returned to the shop. When she saw the clock, her eyes filled with tears, just as the man's had all those years ago. She ran her fingers over the polished surface, and when Elliot wound it and set it on the counter, she just stood there for a moment, listening to the ticking sound. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." Elliot smiled. "It was my pleasure." As the woman left the shop, Elliot felt a familiar warmth spread through him. He had restored many clocks over the years, but each one still carried the same meaning, the same connection to the past. He knew now, more than ever, that his work was about more than just fixing machines. It was about restoring time, memory, and hope. And as he sat down at his workbench once more, Elliot knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The clocks would continue to tick, and with each one, a little piece of the past would live on.